Kia ora everyone and welcome back to the IA Max channel. In today's video, I'll talk about the Azure Functions, what are they and how to create your first one. So let's dive in. Before we start to build our first Azure Function, let's talk about what Azure Functions are in the first place. Azure Functions are Microsoft serverless computing to run your code on the cloud. Serverless does not mean no servers are used to run your code. It just means that you are running your code on someone else's infrastructure. And in this case, it's the Microsoft Azure infrastructure. What that means is that once my Azure function stops running, the underlying infrastructure is released back to Microsoft Azure. So I don't need to worry about maintaining that infrastructure. I would only need to worry about running my code. What that also means, I will only be charged for the time my Azure function was running and using that underlying infrastructure. One other benefit of using Azure Functions is that if the workload on your Azure function increases, Microsoft will auto-scale the underlying infrastructure to keep up with the increased demand. When to use an Azure function, or where does it make sense to actually use Azure Functions? So if you have multiple business streams or multiple applications and then you want to piece them together into one workflow so that the output of one application will be the input to the other, Azure Function is a great solution to do that for you. One other good case of using Azure Functions is that if you know you don't need your app to be running all the time, and you don't want to be paying for an idle resources that you are not using. You only want to be paying for resources that you use. A very good example of such an app is an event-triggered app or an app that is running on a schedule. So in our diagram here, we could see that we've got devices or an IoT devices that are sending messages to an event hub. The message being in the event hub, this would trigger an event that would be sent to the Azure function. The Azure function would perform some sort of logic and then would decide either to send the message to a storage queue or to send it to a Cosmos DB based on the type of the message. The other good example is that if you have a web app and some user is trying to access that web app, so if the content is available in a CDN, they would be served from that CDN. But if the content is not, they would be forwarded to the API management, and with that, we will use authentication to make sure that the user is entitled to access those resources. And then after that, this HTTP GET message will trigger an event to the Azure function. That Azure function will perform whatever business logic that you wanted to do, and then it would send a read message to the Cosmos DB to get the information that the user is looking for. So as you could see here, the Azure function could be used in multiple scenarios, and in all these scenarios, it's only temporary. So like the message that you receive from an IoT device or a user that wants to get access to some data, you don't want your app to be running all the time waiting for the event to happen or waiting for the user to send a request. You only want your function to be, or your code to be running as a response to those triggers or as a response to a schedule to perform your logic, and then we'll stop that, releasing back the infrastructure to back to Microsoft Azure and stopping you from being billed for resources that you don't use. Let's now dive a little bit deeper into Azure Function and let's talk about the Azure Function architecture. So like many other serverless computing offered by Microsoft, Azure Function has the following architecture. So each Azure function would need a trigger. It could be a message from an event hub. It could be an HTTP GET request, and a blob storage getting a file stored in it. There are multiple events that would be used as a trigger for an Azure function to run. And then we've got something called an input binding, which means it's a source for the Azure function to read some data from, and then an output binding, which is a place where the Azure function will be writing some data. And then finally, we've got the Azure function itself containing our code and performing our logic. A trigger is the event or the condition that will cause our Azure function to run. And each Azure function can only have one trigger associated with it. And a trigger is just a special type of binding that is always in the in direction. As opposed to input and output binding, an Azure function could have one or more input or output binding. As for the action or the Azure function code, this is the actual business logic that you want your Azure function to be performing using the trigger, the input and output binding. The one final concept that I want to talk about before creating our first Azure function is what is called the Function.json file or the configuration file. In this file, I define what services I want my Azure function to have access to. And as you could see here, it's using simple code. And for me to access a storage account or an Azure message queue without me having to complicate my Azure function code to write all the necessary steps for me to access a blob storage or an Azure table. So basically, in here we are just saying defining the bindings, and in this case, we are saying the binding parameter is called myBlob. It's a type of a blob trigger. It's in the in direction, which means it's an input direction, and then some more configuration or some more variables about that specific parameter. And then again, for the table, it's called myTable. It's a type of table. It's an out table. And what that means is that my Azure function would be using, would be expecting a blob trigger. So like if you store a file in a blob storage, it would trigger an event and would run my Azure function. And then once the function finished running its logic, it would start to write the output of that data into a table. So now that we are ready, let's start to create our first Azure function on Microsoft Azure Portal. To start, log into the Azure Portal by going to portal.azure.com, and then in the search bar, search for function, and then pick the function app. From there, to create a new function, click on the create, and then pick the your own subscription. And then pick the subscription you want to create the Azure function in, and then pick a resource group. Give your function a name, and then decide if you want your function to be in code or if you want it to be a container, the Docker container. I'll leave it to code. And then finally, we'll pick what runtime stack I want to build my Azure function in. What that basically means, my code will be what? Like if you want to run it in JavaScript or .NET, in C# or PowerShell core. In my case, I'll pick PowerShell core, and then I'll decide where to host my Azure function. So I'll pick Australia East. This means the operating system means what is the underlying infrastructure is going to be using. So I'll leave it to the default of Windows. And then in here, it's talking about what type of plan or what type of an app service plan you want to give your Azure function. I'll keep it to consumption based, but if you want to have VNet integration, you need to pick the premium subscription. Next, I'll need to pick a storage account because I need to store my configuration file, the function.json file. I need to store my code, and I would need it for Azure function. Would need it for some internal processes. So I'll leave it to new, and then networking. We don't, as you could see here, we don't have VNet integration because it's only available with the premium subscription, which is okay for our case today. And then for monitoring, I'm going to enable application insight because I want to show you some of the logs of once we run our Azure function. And finally, we click review and create. So it's ready. Let's create our first Azure function. So now that our function is ready, let's click on go to resource. And as you can see here, this is the resource group that we picked for our Azure function and what subscription on and where is it hosted. So to start to create our our business logic, click on under the functions and click on the functions tab, and then click on create. This is where we start to define what type of logic our function is going to perform, or like what type of trigger is going to start our function, what is the input binding for it, what's the output for it. And I'll create today three basic or common type of business logic that an Azure function can perform, and we could use that as an example to create even more complicated Azure functions. So the first thing that I'll create is the HTTP trigger one. This is a list of template functions that we could create. So if we click on the HTTP trigger, in here this is giving us like the name of the function. So I'll call it function 1 HTTP trigger. What that means is that the function will be triggered by an HTTP request. In here, it's also asking me about the authorization level. So once I create that function, that will give me a URL that I can access that function from. So what that is telling me, so if a user is accessing your Azure function, do you want them to provide an API key? And for that, you could either pick function or admin based on, like, if you want an API key to be associated with each function, specifically use the function. If you want it to be associated with a user, so like all functions from a specific user, use the type admin, sorry. For me, in this case today, I'll use anonymous. I don't want to create an API key, but this is, of course, not recommended for a production environment. Let's click on create. And now our function is ready. Let's click on it and see more details. Under the developers tab, click on the code and test. This is where we get to see our files here. The first thing that we see is, of course, the function itself, and as you can see here, it's a function called run.ps1, which means it's a PowerShell function. And then if we click on the tab here, we could see the other file, which we talked about, the configuration file. And here it's talking about what type of binding we've got. So we've got an input binding and an output binding here. And in this case, the input binding is actually the trigger. As we said, each function needs a trigger, and it can only have one trigger. And in this case, it's an HTTP type of trigger. It's also talking about that we picked authorization level of anonymous, and then it is saying what is the HTTP request going to be about. It's either could be a get method or a post method, right? And then what's the output? The output would be a response in HTTP as well. Now let's go back and look at what the actual code is, like what is the function or a function is going to perform. And the one thing that I want to mention before I talk about this is that this is just a template provided to us by Microsoft. We could put whatever type of code or whatever type of logic in here. It's just something that we could use for inspiration. So what that basically is talking about, without going into the details, is just saying we are expecting a parameter called request, and with that request we've got some metadata, and we are saying if the name in that request is, if you don't provide a name, if not name, then print this message, which this message is going to say this HTTP trigger function executed successfully, pass a name. And if you pass a name, otherwise it will say hello, then it would put the name that you passed, this HTTP trigger function executed successfully. So let's test this function. Let's see what's going to happen when we trigger this function. So to do so, just click on the test and run. This will give us a place where we could test our function within the portal. So what is this saying? It is saying we are going to send, in the input direction, we are going to send an HTTP method of post, and then we are going to send a name of an Azure. So if I click run, it'll take a second, and it came back with an output here. What that output is saying, it's saying that it gave me the message of HTTP response code of 200, which means it's okay. And then because we passed the name of Azure, it says, hello Azure, this HTTP trigger function run successfully. If we go back to the input and delete the Azure name and run the function again, because we didn't, as you could see here, because we didn't pass a name, it gave us the other message, because in here say if not name, then print this message. So in here say the function still run okay, but it was expecting some input data that it didn't get, so please pass this data. The other thing that I wanted to show you here is that if you go back to the developers tab here and then we click on the integration, it's going to give us a visual diagram of what is the function, of how we created the function actually. So as you could see here, it is saying for the trigger, we are using an HTTP request. And this is what the function or the function code, which is our PowerShell code. And this is what the function output here. If we click on, if we wanted to add more input binding, if you click on add input, it's going to give us a list of possible inputs that we could use. So we could say like, I want you to also with the trigger, with the HTTP trigger, to take some data from a blob storage or from a Cosmos DB and so on and so forth. And just for the sake of the example here, we're just going to take a blob storage, and let's hit OK. It's just going to take a second to update our function logic. And if we go back to the code and test again, and if we look at the configuration file, the Function.json, we see that we have another input binding here. As you can see, it is saying input binding, a name of input blob, and then it's type of blob, and it's in the in direction. So this is another way for you to actually configure your function. Beside configuring the JSON file, you could visually configure it with whatever input and output binding that you want to add to your function. But as you can see here, we could only have one trigger associated with the Azure function. One other thing that I wanted to share with you is that when we created the function, we actually configured application insight for it for monitoring. This will give us log messages to tell us more details about when our function was run. So in this case, it's saying the function was triggered by an HTTP request, and it was triggered by a host API call, and then it was the function ran successfully, and also tells us the time that when the function ran, how long did the function kept on running, and so on. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below, and as always, stay strong, kia kaha. See ya.